Today we're going to be diving into the basics of how to use these nodes, and we're going to be creating this kind of sparkler setup, which is actually a part of my asset pack that I am working on. You can check that out here and download the free lightning sample. So before we get on to making this kind of cool spark effect, we need to first start with the basics so you understand how the simulation zone actually works in geometry nodes here. So here I have a geometry node set up on this cube here. We're going to go ahead and make this cube move forward on the Y. So let's go ahead here. We'll search for simulation zone. And what we're going to do is plug our geometry in here. And then we're going to plug our geometry in here. And you'll notice here that our cube disappears. And this is the first thing that I want to point out about simulation nodes. And that's that simulation nodes turns Blender into a simulation. So just like any other simulation, it needs to be cached. So if I come back here, you'll see that that resets, because once we go to the first frame, it will reset the cache. And then as we play forward, it will then begin caching every frame, everything that's going to occur within this simulation zone. Now, just like any other kind of cache in Blender, this can actually be baked out or saved to your hard drive, but it's kind of hidden over here under menus you might not think to look under. So what you need to actually do is go to the physics tab. And then once you have the simulation zone here, you will now have a simulation nodes drop down. You can then calculate to frame. So if I go ahead, skip ahead here, we can calculate all up to that frame. And we can also cache this, which it's doing by default, delete that cache or bake out that cache as well. And then likewise here, if we come under the modifier, we can go ahead and set up a file path here for our bake under the internal dependencies. So diving into how we can actually make things work within the zone, by default, everything we put in here will be calculated every frame. So let's take a look at that. If I go ahead here and transform geometry, I'm going to toss that in here in between those two connections, and you'll see how the zone has fit to accommodate it. That means that this node is now within the simulation zone, and by default will be calculated every frame as we move forward. So if I go ahead and add something like 0.1 here, what that means is that this node is intending to translate the geometry 0.1. But since it is in this zone, it will translate the geometry 0.1 every frame. So if we hit play here, we can see that our cube is now running along the axis. So you can also drag values in here. So let's go ahead here, drag a vector value. And we don't need this vector value to be within the simulation node, but this can be set to send information inside the simulation. So let's go ahead, grab that vector value, put that into the translation there, and let's set a low value like 0.05 on the X. And if we go ahead and hit play, you can see here that we are getting a similar result. Likewise, you'll notice that we have an input and an output, so we can do a lot of elements before we get into the simulation input. So for example, if I wanted to delete this, and I go ahead and add a transform geometry here and a transform geometry here at the end as well, I can go ahead and translate this once up on the y-axis, and then let's kind of do one on the z-axis as well. And you can see here now that it has gone one up on the z-axis and one on the y-axis, but when I hit play, it's only going to use this information here. So it will only simulate what is in this zone. So now that we understand those basics, let's go ahead and start making something a little bit more interesting, like that sparkler effect I showed you at the beginning of the video. Great, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead here and we're going to add a plane. I'm going to name this plane Spark. Then I'm going to click New on the geometry nodes down here, and I'm going to name this Spark Nodes. Perfect. So that kind of gives us a good starting point there. Now what we're going to do is add a simulation zone. So let's go ahead here, search for simulation. Perfect. We're going to go ahead and delete this group input. We're not going to be using that. We'll go ahead and move this over here, and we're just going to drag this onto the geometry so that we can kind of see what we're doing as we're working on it. Great. Now what we're going to do is kind of generate an emitter to kind of get our sparks flying off of. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a grid. I'm going to move this here. Now, if you hold Control Shift when you click, it'll actually put this viewer node so you can see what you're working on specifically. And I'm just going to leave these at the default settings here, but I'm going to go ahead and add a empty, which we will use to emit from. So let's go ahead here and add an empty. We'll go ahead, add empty here, and we're going to call this emitter. Great. We're also going to drag up here on our geometry nodes and add a timeline. I think that this should be part of the default setup, so I recommend going ahead and saving this if you haven't already. Now let's go back to the beginning here. We're going to grab our spark emitter here. And what we can do is you'll notice that it disappeared when that wasn't clicked. So you just need to make sure that you have that viewer clicked in order for it to be visible. So up here, we're going to grab our emitter empty and we're going to bring this into here. And you'll see down here that we have emitter. We're just going to leave these settings as default. Now let's go ahead up here and we're going to search for a set position. We're going to put that there. And then we're going to drag the location of that emitter here into the offset. So now when we grab that emitter and move that around, we go ahead, turn off this viewer here. Let's plug this geometry here so we can see what we're doing. When we grab this emitter here and move this around, you can see that it is moving our plane around. So when we do that with the simulation nodes, what it's going to do is end up kind of shifting our emitter around so that the sparks will follow this empty. Because in the final product, this plane will not be visible. Great, now we need to go ahead and add some points onto this face. So we're going to go ahead here, we're going to grab distribute points on faces, and we're going to drag that over here on the geometry, and you'll see that we start to get these points on our faces here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and leave all these settings to default, but we're going to add a scene time. And we're going to plug that scene time frame into the seed. And what that's going to do is at every frame, it's going to reset the seed of those points and thus give us different emission points at every frame and creating kind of that random effect that we want when we're doing the sparkler. Next up, we need to go ahead and add this to our simulation node. So let's go ahead here. We're going to add a join geometry in here. Go ahead, put that right there. And we're just going to go ahead and plug this into here, plug this back into here so you can see what we're doing, and go ahead and just play and see what it looks like. Great, so now that we have this set up, let's go ahead here. We're going to store a named attribute, bring this up here, and we're going to grab a named attribute down here. Let's go ahead, drag this attribute off into a add math node. And we'll set this value to 1. We're going to set this to an integer. We're also going to set this one to an integer. And then let's go ahead and name this age. And then we'll go ahead and put age up here as well. Now we'll take this attribute, plug it into the top value here. And we're going to plug this value here into the value at the bottom. Great. Now let's go ahead and add a few more elements here. So we're going to go ahead and do the set position node next. So let's set a position here. Go ahead, put this up here in between those. And then we want to offset that based off our velocity, which we'll be creating a bit later. But as part of that, we're going to go ahead, add a named attribute down here. And we're going to change this to a vector. And then we're going to add a random value node. So we'll grab this down here, switch this to the vector as well. And we're going to add these together with a vector math. So let's go add vector math, add. And go ahead and put this one in the bottom, leave this to add. Then we're going to scale this vector math. So we'll go ahead, scale that vector math. Perfect. And let's set this to a lower value, something like 0.37. Great. Now we have this, move this back, plug this vector here up into the offset, and then we're going to name this velocity. Now let's add another store named attribute, and this one's going to be for the velocity. So we'll change this from a float to a vector value, and we're going to name this one velocity. And we're going to plug some information into this one as well. Again, we're going to use a named attribute with a vector value. but we're going to be using the vector or velocity value here. So we can just go ahead, duplicate that one over, drag this off here, and we'll put this as a add vector math. And we'll plug this into a scale vector math. Now just leave that scale there to 1, and we are going to change this value here. So let's go ahead, set that around maybe a smaller value, like negative 0.09. And we can plug this up here into the stored named attribute. Right there into the value. Let's add one more set position node here. And we're going to use this velocity value again. Grab this here, plug this into a scale vector math, and set a really tiny value here, something like 0.05. And we're going to plug that into the set position down here. So now when we hit play, you can see that we're starting to get kind of that sparkler motion, but it's all kind of flying in one direction. Well, now we can use these controls we've done here to start to adjust some of those parameters. So first of all, let's take a look here at the velocity here. You can see here that with this negative number, we're essentially kind of generating gravity. So if you go ahead here and just make this lower, we'll make basically a steeper gravity. So I'm going to go ahead and do negative 0.098 again. And then you can adjust some of these other parameters with the scale as well. So you can see how that scale is kind of affecting things as well. So you can go ahead and play with some of these various numbers if you like. Here you can see it's kind of adjusting the actual speed of the velocity, and this is more the gravity, and then this is kind of stacking on top of that. So that's what those individual nodes do. But what we want to adjust right now is this random value, because you'll notice here that if we come to the top view, it's basically only spewing out in the direction of the X and the Y. And as kind of a sparkler, we want this to go in every direction. So by playing with these random values, we can just give it a bit more leeway and tell it that it can also go these directions. So let's go ahead here. And right now you see it's zeroed out there. So let's add negative 0.5, maybe negative 0.2 here. You can really play with these numbers and get what you want. I'm going to do 0.5 this direction, 0.2 that direction. Let's go ahead here, hit play. You can see now we're getting a much more even spread. You can also go ahead and copy these numbers over there if you want it to be kind of a purely kind of spherical shape going every direction. Perfect. So those are kind of the settings there and how you can play with those. So let's go about how we want to make this actually look like a sparkler. And then one more thing we need to do as well is ensure that eventually these points delete. Otherwise, we're just going to keep generating points. And if you had a very long timeline, you might start to lag as you just generate thousands of points in your scene that are just kind of collecting and needing to be accounted for. So we're going to use delete geometry with the age factor and use that to delete our geometry after a certain frame. So we'll do that after the simulation output. So I'm going to grab this, pull this out here, and we're going to do a delete geometry. And we're going to put that right there. And by default, it's going to go ahead and delete everything, which of course we don't want to do. So we need to utilize this selection here. So we're going to use a named attribute, and we're going to use the same one we did before, and that's that age attribute. So we'll go ahead, change this here to an integer, and that means that it'll only measure in single fold numbers, meaning that it's only going to work on kind of full frame numbers, so we won't be deleting things in between frames. So we'll go ahead here, name this one age, and we'll drag this attribute off into a greater than math node. And make sure that's set to integer as well. And then let's also add a scene time here. And we'll bring this down here and we'll pull the frames off here. And we're going to do an equal to compare. And we'll plug that into the A at the top, leave this the float and equal. And we'll set the B to 1. And then we are going to combine these with a add node. So we actually want this down here on the bottom there. We're going to plug this into the selection here. And then now when we hit play, you'll see that we still have no geometry. And that's because we need to pick a greater than number here. So let's go ahead and pick 15. And you'll see here that about every 15 frames, it's kind of deleting those. So if you want those to last longer, just make that number longer. But I'm going to go ahead, set mine to 15 since I'm going for a sparkler. I want those to kind of quickly die out. So up until this point, we've been generating just the points. Now we're going to add some shape to it and then start working on the shader as well. So first of all, let's grab this here and we'll click New Shader and let's call this Spark Matte. Great. Now we can come back here to our geometry node setup and we'll be able to call upon that in a minute. But first, let's add some instances on these points. Right now, we're viewing the actual points and have no objects instancing on it. So we'll create an object and then have that appear on all of these points. So we will add an instance on points and put that there and feed the points into it. And you'll notice they disappear because they no longer have an instance to reference. And we're going to create that right now. So we will create a curved line. And this is what will form the shape of our object. Go ahead and just leave this as is. We will set the curve radius there. And we're going to take this radius and bring this down here into a spline parameter. And we'll plug that into the factor. And that's going to use the length of the spline to determine the radius as it goes, giving us a tapered look. We'll drag this into a curve to mesh. And we'll drag that profile curve off into the shape that we want. And we want a circular shape. So we'll type in curve circle. And we do not need all this resolution. That will just lag our scene. So we'll drop that to something low like 8 and set the radius to something really, really small. I'm going to do 0.002. Now, when we plug this into our instance here, we should begin kind of seeing these little sparkle-like shapes. You can see that they have a tiny radius there. You can crank that up if you want, and that they're getting a taper from that factor fed into the radius. So that gives us our basic shape. And when we click play now, you can see that they're falling, but all in the same direction. We want to create more of an arcing motion with these. So we're going to play with the rotation factor here, utilizing some normals and other little tricks. So what we're going to do is drag our emitter back into here. We're going to grab a UV sphere and use this to align our rotation. We can leave this at 32 and 16 just by default. And we're going to plug this into a set position node. And if I go ahead and view that, you can see that we're just creating this to kind of emit from with our rotation. So let's go ahead, delete that. And we're going to plug the rotation of our emitter into the offset. This is just to ensure that that sphere that the rotation is following also follows that emitter. Now what we can do is grab this geometry, pull this into the sample nearest surface. Go ahead there, and we'll set this to, sorry, I grabbed the sample nearest surface. There we go, and we'll plug that into there. We will grab the vector here, and we will drag this value off into the normal. So now we're kind of storing all that data in there. And then we are going to drag this value into a align Euler to vector. And we will plug this into the vector value. We'll set this to Z. And then we're going to call upon one of our named attributes. So we'll put a named attribute there, change that to vector, and feed the velocity into this one. Now we'll go ahead and take that attribute, plug that into the rotation so that velocity will play a role into the rotation with the normals there. And go ahead, take all this and plug it into the rotation. And now you'll see that we're starting to get kind of this, this falling motion with a little bit more of a spark shape. Great. So the last thing we need to do is go ahead and create the shader material. So I'm going to switch over here to the shading tab and ensure that's on there. And in order to apply this under geometry nodes, what you can do is add a set material right there. And then we're going to select that spark material that we've made. And then now we can access all that information here on our geometry nodes. So let's make a simple spark material. Now I just want to be in Eevee mode just to make this really simple. And I'm going to switch to the rendered view there and go ahead and just create a black world there. So right now you can see that we're not seeing anything. And I'm actually just going to use an emission shader. So using this emission shader right here, we'll plug that into there. And you'll see that we're starting to get some color there. Let's go ahead, add some just bloom just for some interest there. And let's put this at a really high value, like 120. And you can already see that by hitting play, we're getting much more the desired result. But let's go ahead and add some visual interest here. So if you remember before, we created that age attribute. Well, now we can call that in here for the age and kind of have the color change over time. And we're going to create a color ramp here and give it some colors to work with first. So we'll plug that in there, and I'm going to go ahead, switch this around here, drag the white value there. And then we kind of want this to kind of darken over time. So let's add a few stops here. Let's make this first one yellow. It'll go from white to yellow, and then from yellow to orange. And you can make this any color you want. Go ahead here and make this like a bright red. Perfect. Now what we need to do is feed that age attribute data in here to change the color of our sparkler over time. So what it'll do is start from white and move all the way over to black as the particles age out. So we can call on that with the attribute node. And if you remember, we stored all those attributes. We'll make this an instancing type because we are calling upon the attributes of an instance. And then we are going to call upon the age attribute by typing in age there. Now, if I go ahead here and plug that factor into there, we'll see that at the moment we don't get anything. So we need to map the range correctly. So we will add a map range here. And we will leave that at float and linear. It doesn't need to be clamped. We'll set the from max to 15 as that is the life that we set in there. If you remember, we set that to 15 frames. So you can set this to whatever you have. And you can see here that we're getting a much more kind of gradual age over time, how it starts white, goes yellow, and then turns red. And of course, you can play with any of these colors. You can also easily add a hue and saturation here and shift that hue to kind of create some more interesting looks or firework looks. Also, a quick shout out to Glass Hand Studios, who did a lot of this pack with me. Great collaborator, and he also has a great channel. Definitely recommend going and checking that out at Glass Hand Films.